the early morning hours of March 29, 1914, deep in the Amazon rainforest, former American President Theodore Roosevelt, racked with fever, summoned his son Kermit to his tent. After traveling an uncharted river in Brazil for over a month, Roosevelt was too weak to continue. He told his son to go on without him.
Roosevelt says, this is it. Either we all die, or I die and you all get out. Obviously, there's no choice. You have to leave me here.
He had conquered so much. He had conquered every challenge that came his way. But now, for the first time, this force of nature has to bow down to nature's force.
Theodore Roosevelt was now one of 21 men lost in one of the last unexplored regions on Earth, facing crippling disease, perilous rapids, and a jungle alive with threats.
The Americans thought in the middle of the night the Indians could come in and slit your throat.
The Amazon jungle eats whatever comes its way. That whole environment consumes whatever moves through it.
No one knew where the river might lead or when their ordeal would end. But one thing was certain. Their fate was in the hands of Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon.
Rondon was tremendously experienced. Colonel Rondon was essentially the Brazilian equivalent of Lewis and Clark.
Rondon knows he's got to get Teddy Roosevelt out of the jungle safe and sound. He can't have the President of the United States dying on him in the middle of the jungle. Don't let him die.
There yet remains plenty of exploring work to be done in South America. As hard, as dangerous, and almost as important as any that has already been done. But the true wilderness wanderer must be a man of action as well as of observation. He must have the heart and the body to do and to endure, no less than the eye to see and the brain to note and record.
On January 21st, 1914, in the most remote section of the Amazon rainforest, former President Theodore Roosevelt and his son Kermit set off on a joint American-Brazilian expedition. Their mission was to chart a mysterious river, known only as the River of Doubt. Snaking its way through a nearly impenetrable rainforest, the river was a tantalizing prize for any would-be explorer, and Theodore Roosevelt hoped to put it on the map. Just 15 months earlier, in November of 1912, Roosevelt had suffered a crushing political defeat after he lost his bid for a third term as president. Wanting to put the election far behind him, he accepted an invitation from the Brazilian government to explore the least known region of the Amazon. No civilized man, no white man, Roosevelt wrote, had ever gone down or up this river.
Theodore Roosevelt has a real fascination with explorers. Explorers who risked their lives to open up unknown lands. Men who risked their lives to advance civilization.
There is the adventure part of it. It was kind of a test Am I tough enough?
There was something in Roosevelt's character that required him to take on challenges, however risky they might seem. And so for Roosevelt suddenly to get the sort of last little glimpse of the true age of exploration was simply too alluring for him to turn down.
In order to reach the River of Doubt, the expedition would first need to trek nearly 400 miles across the broad savannas and tropical forests of the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. Guiding Roosevelt and his six-man American team was a 48-year-old Brazilian Army officer and part Amazonian Indian, Colonel Candido Rondon. Though he stood just 5 feet 3 inches tall, Rondon was a formidable figure. He'd spent over a decade laying miles of telegraph wire deep into the interior of the rainforest, and he knew more about the Brazilian Amazon than any man alive.
Rondon built 2,000 miles of telegraph line, 1,000 miles of it through a swamp, and 900 miles of it through the jungle.
Rondon was tremendously experienced. Colonel Rondon was essentially the Brazilian equivalent of Lewis and Clark.
But just as Colonel Rondon began leading the men to the river, it became clear that the expedition had a problem. The Americans had arrived with a mountain of baggage. Hundreds of crates stuffed with collecting jars, camera equipment, and comforts from home like bacon, wine, and chocolates. Provisions that were never meant to be hauled overland through the wilderness. Roosevelt and his men had originally planned a simple hunting and collecting trip along the much-traveled Paraguay River. But after arriving in Brazil, Roosevelt changed the itinerary. He accepted an offer from the Brazilian government and Colonel Rondon to take on the much more dangerous River of Doubt expedition.